All right, so our fun conversation for this week is going to be Form 35, the inspection contingency. So the things that I would like to get covered today, and this may spark some conversation, I don't know. We will be talking about why a buyer should perform the inspection. Why does it also maybe protect the seller to allow the inspection? Who can do the inspection? What happens if the buyer acts as their own inspector? And am I required to deliver the inspection report? We'll also be talking about who can trigger the additional inspections and why we use this inspection contingency, as in why we use this instead of maybe a blank addendum. So why does it matter? We are in a state right now that puts a lot of responsibility in the hands of the buyer. So last week we talked about the Form 17 and how it's required that the seller disclose any material facts they know about the house. What we're doing though in that situation is we're putting everything on the seller to say what they know. It is what they only know at the time, current problems that are being had, but doesn't really dig much further than the surface. So by adding in the option for the buyer to conduct their own inspection, we're actually relieving a little bit of responsibility from that seller and putting it back in the hands of the buyer. We are technically still a buyer beware state, meaning the state sees the buyers as the ultimate decision makers. So they, in the past, cases have kind of leaned more towards, hey, buyer, you had the opportunity to find these things out. It was on you to do the discovery. So a lot of pressure is put on a buyer's due diligence to find out anything they need to know about the house. If we're the sellers and we are putting that out there, we're giving our disclosure, it actually does work to our best interest as sellers to allow the buyer that chance to discover what they can. And if something was missed, we didn't remove that chance from them. So if we deny the buyers what they have, the right and kind of the requirement to find out, we're putting the sellers at a potential risk of only relying on that disclosure. So make sure that we kind of see both sides of this, and we are representing the facts that we know. And when we can, we're going to be allowing the buyers to discover items for themselves. So I pulled up the inspection contingency. The one I'm talking about is going to be Form 35. There's a couple different types of inspections that we have access to. Specifically, I'm going to talk about the home inspection contingency. So the first and most important part that I wanted to highlight right here is this is on the buyer. This is a general home inspection that is performed by the buyer, paid for by the buyer. It is ordered by the buyer. It's completely at the buyer's expense. Now, we do in the state of Washington have a requirement that if an inspection is being done, or if anything is being done, it needs to be done by somebody who is licensed to do so if that action requires a license. Now, technically, a home inspection does require a license. So this means it has to be a home inspector that is licensed to do these home inspections, or we do offer the buyer to be their own home inspector. Same thing with roofing, plumbers, anybody who's required to have a license in our state has to have a license to do the inspections for that specific thing. I need to move my bar here. Okay. When we use the inspection contingency, the buyer has the right to also re-inspect the repairs they've agreed on for the work to be done. So if they've negotiated this on a Form 34, we really don't have this provision that allows them to do it. So when possible, try to negotiate repairs on a 35R or 35W. The explanation for it is in paragraph 7 right here, when it gives the right to go back and re-inspect line 75. It says if the buyer elects to order and pay for such re-inspections, they can. They are to be done and repaired for in the same manner that has been discussed in the beginning of this form. So if it was a licensed plumber, then they need to have the license as required by the law. There are a lot of provisions in this form that kind of follow along. So it's not just the negotiation of the repairs, but it's also the fact that if the property is damaged, they're going to say that they're going to return it to the original condition. You get a lot more protections in a Form 35 than if you just had one sentence in a 34 asking for something to be done. If you want to waive inspection but ask for repairs, you can ask for them in the 35W. So paragraph 3 gives you the space to ask for anything that you would like and still waive inspection. So you're just waiving the fact that you are not going to go back into the home and do the inspection, but not waiving the repairs you're asking for. By doing this, you still also have the same sort of ending opportunities to go back and re-inspect. It has the attorney provision. So it gives you the protections of the inspection contingency without having to have an inspection contingency itself. So who can?
I'm sorry, could I ask a question on that?
Sure.
I was just curious. So are you saying that, so if you were waiving your inspection on that 35W, would you, I've never actually done this as far as waiving the inspection and then also asking for the modifications and repairs. So would you check both of those boxes on the 35W? Would you check the waiver and then the modification and then write that in? Is that the best practices for that?
Yeah, and if you were doing the pre-inspection and you wanted modifications, you could also check those two boxes.
Got it. Thank you.
Yeah, you're welcome. It just gives you that extra paragraph at the bottom. I mean, these ways are not, of course, they're not the only ways to do these things. Sometimes if it is something really simple, maybe using a 34 would make more sense. But if it comes to something that's got a little bit of complication to it, if it's something that you need to maybe repair, like re-inspect at the end, consider using something that gives you the right to do that re-inspection, because without this, you're basically stuck doing like a 5-day walkthrough instead. So who can inspect? In our state, we can have the buyer inspect, a licensed home inspector, and anybody that would be considered a specialist. So this would be the electrician, plumber, roofing contractor. Maybe you want to have a company come in to look at mold, any other specialist. And all of these people can come in during your initial inspection period. If you want to only have a sewer inspection, there's actually a new sewer inspection form. This is only for like a scoping. So if you're doing a sewer scoping with the 35, you don't need to add this form too. But if you wanted to say waive that home inspection and then have a sewer scoping, you can actually add this form. It's a 22SI, if you can see the corner there. This allows you to do a sewer scoping. All right, so buyer's obligations. Buyer has things that they need to uphold and seller has things they need to uphold in this. A buyer has to be the one to order the inspection. They have to pay for it. They have to hire somebody who is licensed if they're a home inspector. They have to make sure that there is no damage to the property. It's not going to be altered. And if it is, it's going to be fixed as to its original condition if they do it. So the buyer does have their obligations. Now, seller, if there is an inspection, the seller is obligated to let that buyer inspect or let those inspectors come in. They are agreeing to cooperate by signing this form. When we are talking about computation of time, this paragraph 3 is the first paragraph that gives the entire inspection contingency timeline. So it will default to 10 days if you don't put any other days in there. This is the total amount of time from start to finish for that inspection contingency. just as kind of a refresher, I guess, for computation of time, when we're thinking about anything 5 days or less, we are going to be thinking about business days, and 6 days or more are going to be thought about in calendar days. If we keep that in mind too, we have to also remember that nothing is going to end on a weekend or a holiday. So if mutual acceptance is Friday and the inspection contingency is 5 days, we will count Monday, Tuesday, Wednesday, Thursday, Friday, and it will end on the following Friday. So 5 days is technically the same thing as writing 7 days in a contract. Sometimes that can be a psychological help if you want it to seem like fewer days, even though it would be the same amount of days. So if Friday was mutual acceptance and contingency was 10 days, we would go Saturday, Sunday, Monday, Tuesday, Wednesday, Thursday, Friday, Saturday, Sunday, Monday. You're only getting a couple extra days. I think you're only getting 2 extra days by doing this. But that is just because we have weekends that we're counting as well, and we're not simply counting calendar days. Also keep in mind all timelines end at 9 p.m. on the date of expiration. Okay, so when you have the inspection contingency, these 3 boxes are new as of July. We used to have 2 before this, earlier this year. As of July 11th, they added the 3rd box. A buyer should not fill these boxes in. This is a seller's decision. So I would recommend sellers going back and filling in these boxes if they choose. Now, if the seller signs the entire contract, comes back around and decides they do want any of these boxes checked, it's not a counter offer. If the buyer comes in and pre-selects any of these boxes and the seller does not want those boxes selected, it would be a counter offer to change it. The other way you can get consent, if you have a mutually signed around contract and then your seller decides, you know what, I just want to see this report. I want one of these boxes checked. We have a Form 35C, and that will give you the same options for those 3 boxes, and you can fill that out. You can also, if you want, go back to the original contract, select one of these boxes and initial on the side. Okay, so some scenarios that kind of come up. If the buyer does their own inspection and notes some items that they need an expert to look at, can they get additional inspections by marking the box? And this is something that has kind of been a long ongoing conversation between several different lawyers in our Washington Realtors collection of lawyers. Right now, according to the Washington Realtor website, it's argued that they cannot get additional inspections if they don't hire an inspector, if they do their own inspections. That I think will be a long debated item. But as of right now, that's the most recent answer that I came across. So keep in mind any additional inspections that you want. This only means you can't necessarily get additional inspection time. It doesn't mean you can't have those inspectors come in throughout your entire inspection contingency. It just means that when it comes down to the additional days, you may get pushback getting those additional days granted, if somebody wants to argue this.
Can I ask a question about this real quick? I'll wait till questions, actually.
Okay. If there is no right for additional inspections, we all know that everybody at the end of the day just wants a sale to close. Buyers and sellers want it to close. They don't necessarily care about, you know, these nuances that happen throughout the contract. And honestly, they probably care a lot less than agents do. So at the end of the day, a lot of people, you know, it just comes down to what it's going to take to close the sale. If there are additional inspections that a buyer would like to do, the seller's willing to go ahead and grant that, you can opt to use even a 34 to negotiate that additional inspection if it's an issue. It's all going to come down to, at the end of the day, what the buyer and the seller want to do and how they're just going to make it work. So just wanted to point out timelines. Unless they're changed, everything will default to 3 days. So these are the negotiation timelines between responses. Once you give the response, it defaults to 3 days for the seller to respond. Then it defaults to 3 days for the buyer to respond. Within those 3 days, once you deliver your inspection response, you cannot interfere with that seller's time to respond. You can't change anything. You have to allow them their time. And the same goes for the buyer. When the seller responds back to the buyer gets the 3 days if they want to use it. You can't change your mind. You can't rescind something that you've sent. And so once you send it, it's sent. They have added, as of, I think it was, when was it? A couple of years ago, last year, the third option at the very, very bottom to go ahead and continue to negotiate until the end of the inspection contingency, which is a really great thing. And a lot of us just use that. So when you ask for repairs, we'll go over, I guess we'll go over this next week too, but when you ask for repairs, the buyer is awarded a reinspection opportunity. So if, say, a roofer comes in and says this roof needs to be replaced, the seller they agree to do it, the buyer can actually hire the same inspector that called out the roof to come back in and look at it and just double check the work that was done. As far as what happens if the work is not done, that's kind of to be decided, but you do have the right to come back and re-inspect the work if you ask for repairs. It just needs to be done by the same inspector who was called in the first time. This is not an inspection contingency for a on-site septic, but rather just an advisory that if there is one, you should have it inspected. So if you do have a septic on the home that you're selling, make sure that you're also including the proper septic addendum. Okay, so here are some kind of situations that have come up. So the buyer has an inspection contingency. The seller has not demanded a copy of the report with the 35C, and surprisingly, the buyer terminates. Can the seller get the report? If the 35C is sent by the seller with the box marked for a full copy, does the seller have to deliver it? In the inspection report, if it's delivered with, the inspection report is delivered without consent, what happens? The inspector feels an obligation or liability if they generate a report that is shared with other parties. All right, so first one, if there's no demand in receiving the report, then the buyer is under zero obligation to deliver it. If the buyer decides they want to, then that's their choice. And the seller can ask nicely and hope to get it if they really want that report. If the 35C is sent and the box is marked for a full copy of the report, once that report is demanded, and it's actually no longer a request, but rather a kind of a demand, the buyer is technically obligated to deliver the entire report. So this is no longer just a, hey, if you feel like you can give that to me, maybe you can. It is an actual demand for the report. What about the inspection report being delivered without consent? I think all of us are on edge with this one, and we all know the consequences. So if there's no consent for the report and it's delivered, technically the inspection contingency is waived. There may be 0 portions of the report given. So not a single page, not a list, not a portion. So make sure if you want to deliver any of it that you get consent with the 35C or you have a box marked. And if the inspector feels like there's a liability or, they're hesitant to share it with other parties, unfortunately, the inspector has no say in how that report is used once it leaves their hands. So the buyer, if the buyer is requested to deliver that inspection report, then the buyer is kind of obligated to that seller to deliver that. And unfortunately, that inspector has zero say in what happens to it after that. What about if the inspection accidentally gets sent by maybe the inspector, or the seller receives a report with consent and chooses not to read it? Or how about if the buyer checks the box for 35C and the seller doesn't want to see the report? If the inspector accidentally sends the report to the listing broker, it's the same thing as delivering the inspection report. So unfortunately, that copy having been delivered is considered a waiver of the contingency. So whether the buyer and seller agree to move forward because of the accident is really up to both of them. But technically they can count that as a waiver of the inspection contingency. The seller, how about the seller receives a report with consent, but chooses not to read it? This would be in a situation where maybe they were going to negotiate repairs and maybe they didn't, just ended up either canceling the contract or, you know, for whatever reason. But the seller said, you know what, I'm not even interested in it. Just throw it away. I don't care. I don't want to see it anymore. Whether they actually read it or not, we can't escape the fact that we should have knowledge of what's in it. So if the seller was delivered the report, it's assumed that they are going to know the information that is inside. So they might as well read it. And then last, if the buyer checks the box for 35C for the consent for the report and seller does not want to see the report, they're going to have to create a counter offer to change the selection, because technically it was the seller's choice to make that box. And if the buyer made the choice for them, they need to create a counter offer to remove that. All right, so that's it for the inspection report or inspection contingency. And next week we can talk about the how to respond, and go into the nitty-gritty on that.